morning, Warsaw. Today is Monday, 4th September. It will be sunny all day with highs of 15 degrees Celsius or 59 degrees Fahrenheit for our American listeners. Sunrise will be at 6:08 a.m. and sunset at 7:31 p.m. We are on the 35th day of the Warsaw Uprising, and the power plant is back under attack, which threatens power for the whole city of Warsaw. Apart from that, what else is happening in Warsaw?
Thanks for that, Philippe. Yeah, I'm going to touch on this in a minute, but before I get to that, there's a lot going on the ground. So, as we all know, as we spoke in the past couple of days, the Old Town has been taken, which now leaves the other districts. Well, Old Town and Sadyba have been taken. We've now left the other districts are pretty much exposed. So, as I mentioned yesterday, the district of Powiśle is the next one to be attacked. My grandfather is based in this district, so I might tell you a little bit more about him later on in the next couple of days. But the civilians in these areas are starting to panic, and the insurgents start to evacuate the civilians out of this district to Śródmieście, the midtown. So it is becoming a critical situation. On top of that, there's a lot of bombing happening in Śródmieście. 100 people are killed during a bombing raid on this day. And the Germans begin to attack various outposts. For example, the Church of the Holy Cross is attacked. I mean, the insurgents only gained it, 10 days ago? 11 days ago they managed to capture it, along with Staszi's Palace, which is right next door to it. Again, if you come on one of my tours, we talk about this whole attack and the general area, and I'll be able to show you everything there. They're also attacking the bank. They're attacking and trying to blow up the sides of the Holy Cross Church, but they managed to stop the Germans attacking, especially at the Saski Garden. They're being attacked from all various sides. They managed to also damage a German assault gun and 2 Goliaths. And if I haven't mentioned, or Roger hasn't mentioned it before, with the Goliaths, the insurgents managed to capture one, and they captured a German who knew how to operate it, and they got him to take it apart, completely apart, so they could understand the workings and how to defeat this Goliath. Is a very clever thing for the insurgents to have done. So they managed to be able to stop the Goliath in its tracks before it managed to get to the destination that they're intending to be blown up by. So coming back to this power plant, so the power plant is hit by a lot of artillery and a lot of aerial bombings. And this is going to continue all the way up to tomorrow, more or less, when it gets completely and utterly destroyed and the insurgents stop getting power, which then again causes another issue for the civilians and everybody who's been dependent on this. It stops the production of newspapers that are being printed. It stops the production of weapons being made. So it really does damage the insurgents having the loss of the power plant, more or less. So what else are the Germans doing? They destroy the headquarters of Monter, which is in the Hotel Victoria. It doesn't exist anymore, doesn't stand there anymore, but there are some other buildings that can be going visited, and we can still be able to see photographs of the Victoria Hotel. So they now move to the Palladium Cinema. Rainer Farth's, don't we? Just, this man gives me the heebie-jeebies every time we mention him. Rainer Farth is now beginning his assault on Powiśle, and it's going to be an incredibly brutal couple of days when it comes down to it, with the massacres of the civilian population, insurgents, but we will come to that in the next few days. The Germans occupy the water supply board as well, which then more or less limits again the insurgents with water. And as the Germans are advancing into that district, they set some of the buildings and some of the houses on fire, which makes it very difficult to defend by the insurgents, because a large percentage of buildings in this area were wooden, so it gives the Germans an advantage to be able to advance and quickly advance into Powiśle, and they will do in the next 2 days, and we'll talk about that a little bit more tomorrow and the day after. But what else is happening on the ground? Well, it's kind of happening really in the air, isn't it, Claire? We've got a bit of propaganda going on.
Well, Roger talked yesterday, didn't he, about this PR war, the propaganda that the Germans are doing, and how mendacious it was. And I don't know if it's possible, but it seems to get even worse today on the 3rd of September. So today the Germans started leaflet dropping, which obviously it's better than dropping bombs, but the leaflets they dropped, mainly it was this document. It's called "Do You Want to Live or Die?" So the Germans have very clearly now know they've got the upper hand. The old town has been evacuated, that's being destroyed, and they are keen to further lower the morale of any civilians and any insurgent fighters they can, so they can, conclude this thing faster and take the whole of Warsaw and then destroy it. So their leaflet says, "Do you want to live or die? We're asking, why do you terrorize women and children? Why do you force women and children to stay inside burning houses? Why do you expose them to hunger, thirst, and certain death? Why do you shoot women and children who want to leave the burning city?" Well, this is not what the insurgents are doing. Admittedly, the insurgents had thought that the Warsaw Uprising, well, they'd hoped it would be over in 2 days. They thought it would be over in 2 weeks. They had no intention of dragging on for 2 months. But the civilians, they had stayed in their cellars. They also, their morale is beginning to change. They are now running out of food. They have seen their loved ones. They've been burying them, if they're lucky to have a body. And so this is quite cunningly playing on those fears, those growing fears. But nobody, the people terrorising women and children here are quite clearly the Germans. Then they carry on. "The Poles who managed to escape your terror are witnesses of your bestial aggression," the German leaflet says. "Why do you say that captured Poles who fall into German hands will be shot? We can tell you the names of hundreds of thousands of people who are amazed that they were treated so humanely. And evacuation trains have taken them to new places where they will find work and food." So this is the Germans saying, come on, civilians, come on, soldiers, put up a bit of white cloth, come to the front lines and we will look after you. They basically saying, we will provision for you. We will give you food. We will give you water. We will give you shelter, and we will relocate you somewhere safer. That is their plea. And of course, that is not what is happening on the ground. But then they move into slightly, building on what the Poles know. They say this month of hopeless fighting has proved that England has once again failed to keep its given word to you, and Russia has refused support and help. Well, they're on safer ground here because Britain has been trying to arm, and not just Britain, the Poles, the South Africans, the Allies have been trying to provide provisions, but obviously the flights have had to be closed because the success rate has been so minimal. That those will restart. And Russia has refused support and help in a very material way. So the Germans are on safer ground here. But then they say, "We guarantee you life, work and bread. Hang out white flags on the barricades. Feel free to approach us voluntarily." At the final line is quite telling. It says, "Otherwise, certain death awaits you." So this is quite powerful stuff. If you have imagined you've been underground, largely living in a cellar for a month, you don't have access to perhaps the radio, the news. You don't really know what the situation is. If you do know what the situation is, the big news at the moment is that the old town has fallen. You've seen the soldiers demoralised, filthy, wounded, coming out of the sewers. None of that is conducive to thinking, we can last another month. There is no end in sight. So you can imagine that this might have some effect. But Poles know. They have seen the appalling brutality of the German forces. So there's very few of them that are now actually going voluntarily with white flags in hand. And that's a good thing, because what is actually happening to people who have been captured, either civilians or fighters, or to people who have voluntarily given themselves up to the German forces, is that they are sent to this camp we've mentioned previously, Pruszków camp, which is a transit camp. And from there, they are being sent to Auschwitz. And so on this day, this is the day that the second transport of civilians is rounded up from the Warsaw Uprising, and they're sent to Pruszków camp before being sent on. 1,956 men were sent to Auschwitz, one of whom had already been held there but had managed to escape. And 1,132 women were sent to Auschwitz, one of whom had been there before. We talked about weddings earlier, how many weddings there were in the Warsaw Uprising, as people, these young fighters were coming together. And that meant that many of the women who were caught now, many of the civilian and female fighters, quite a few of those were pregnant. They were sent to Pruszków. And of course, they were then sent on to Auschwitz. Now, if you were Jewish arriving at Auschwitz at this point, you don't have any life expectation. You're pretty much being sent straight to your death. But the Poles, many of them did survive. These pregnant women who gave birth, their offspring didn't really have a chance. There was one little child, Julita, Kolczynska, she was born in Auschwitz, but sadly died a few days later. And both of her parents had actually been deported with her, and both of them sadly died on this day as well. But a lot of these, the Polish baby survival rate was very low just because the women hadn't had enough food. For the last month during the fighting in Warsaw, they couldn't produce enough milk on the nutrition that they had, so there was nothing to feed these newborns. So, but these Polish babies born to women who had served in the Warsaw Uprising or who'd been civilians during the Warsaw Uprising, very few of them survived. There are these appalling humanitarian consequences of the rising ongoing. How aware was the rest of the world about these conditions, Roger?
Really not very much. I mean, there are various accounts, as we know, from people like John Ward who are reporting out, and the government in exile through its ministries and so on was trying to get that message out. But as we've heard before, there was a sort of tendency in Western circles increasingly to take the Soviet line at face value. And as we've said before, to sort of view the Poles increasingly as a sort of an irritant in the relations between the great powers, between the Grand Alliance. So even if those messages did get out, there's a sort of tendency to, I think, to not necessarily disbelieve them, but maybe discount them and consider perhaps that those losses, maybe they're exaggerated, and if they are bad, then it's a consequence of Polish recklessness or whatever it is. So there's various factors that might sort of preclude a sort of sensible acceptance of those stories.
And of course, we're now in the summer of 44, and the story is one of the liberationary forces coming in from the West, of both sides from the East as well, pushing the Germans back towards, starting to push them back towards eventually what will be Berlin. And so there is this sense that the tide of the war has turned, that the story the publics are wanting to hear is a positive news story, and then you have this horrific blip in the middle of it. So I think perhaps there is an unwillingness to hear it as well.
Just to throw this in there, I mean, the Soviets aren't doing anything to help either.
I think that's very true. It should be said as well, but at the same time, that three-cornered wrestle between Churchill, Roosevelt and Stalin over the prospect of, getting some aid to Warsaw, and the Soviets, of course, as we've said, being very resistant to that idea and refusing landing rights to Allied aircraft, for example. That battle is still ongoing. That wrestle is still ongoing. And on the 4th of September, Churchill sends a telegram to Moscow where he starts by actually, being quite sort of emollient. And he says, whatever was right or wrong about the start of the Warsaw Rising, he says, the people of Warsaw alone cannot be held responsible for the decision taken. So basically appealing, if it was possible, to Stalin's better nature, if such a thing existed, appealing on the basis of sympathy for the ordinary civilians of Warsaw. And he goes on to say, our nation cannot understand why help was not sent from the outside, for example, equipment for the Poles of Warsaw. And the fact that such aid could not be sent because of your government's refusal to allow American planes to land on airfields in Russian hands is now becoming widely known. So he's making that point, that this is a PR disaster potentially for the Soviet Union. Stalin, as we've said, is held in high esteem by the Western powers, by Western, chattering classes, if you like, bien pensant opinion, as is the Soviet Union. And Churchill is throwing up the possibility that could change, and that Warsaw could be the catalyst that would bring about that change. Now, there's open question, obviously, as to how much that would influence Stalin, but it's interesting that he's raising that particular spectre.
It's interesting as well, given that we've just been saying how the British and Americans, the Western allies themselves, are kind of disregarding the situation in Warsaw to a certain extent, and yet Churchill is using that as a lever with Stalin.
Yeah, indeed. And I think this is, Churchill, I mean, much lauded in sort of British circles, even still, but amongst Poles, it's a much more questionable legacy of someone like Churchill, and he is seen, and I think with some degree of justification, as somebody who colluded in the sort of yet another betrayal of Poland. But you can see here, I think this is Churchill actually trying to a little bit to fight his corner. He is, as we've said before, he's the weakest of the three in terms of his boots on the ground and his strategic influence and all the rest of it. So this is him actually really trying to on the one hand, appeal to Stalin's better nature, but also raise this spectre of the Soviet Union and Stalin being shamed by international opinion. However, justified that prospect might have been, but that's what he's trying to do. And in a way, we have to understand he is doing his best. He's just in a very difficult situation.
However much I really want to be critical of Churchill right now, it's really difficult because his hands are tied. He alone cannot be the one to supply Poland with Allied drops. These aeroplanes are coming from Italy. They have to do a run there and a run back over enemy territory. It's becoming a really difficult situation for him. And without Stalin giving him the opportunity to be able to stop and refuel on Soviet territory, it kind of limits the British planes a little bit, including the Americans. The Americans aren't going to be doing any drops anytime soon. We're already on the 3rd of September. We've gone 35 days into the Warsaw Uprising, and it's only going to go completely downhill now. And pushing Stalin is the only thing he can do to be able to push this forward.
Absolutely, but as we've said, numerous times, there's no interest on the Soviet part and on Stalin's part to, materially assist the insurgents in Warsaw because they're fighting for a different cause. So, that's the bottom line. So he'll play along and he'll string this through, and he'll string it along for long enough that the rising will collapse of its own accord, and then as far as he's concerned, it's problem solved.
Right, thank you so much for listening to Day 35. Hopefully I've got the dates right this time, because this is just becoming very difficult. After the first 31st days, it just becomes an absolute mental head case to be able to try and keep the correct dates. And as Zane has pointed out to me numerous times, I keep getting it wrong. But hopefully today I will get it right, that you'll come back for Day 36, which is tomorrow. But we got an email this afternoon from Peter. Thank you, Peter, for your very kind words. I really appreciate that one. And Peter's asked for a couple of book recommendations, which is a great point, which I hadn't thought about doing recently. But what I'm going to do, I'm going to start with one book first. Roger's going to kill me for going down this way, because he would say Norman Davies. I would say yes, Norman Davies, but first I would definitely go for Alexander Ricci's Warsaw 1944, Hitler, Himmler and the Crushing of a City. That's probably the most up-to-date research we've got at the moment, and I would definitely go for that one. Also, if you're interested in the history of Poland, because she does touch on the Warsaw Uprising, is Halik Kochański, and she's written the book on the Eagle Unbowed, Poland and the Poles in the Second World War. So there is a fabulous chapter on the Warsaw Uprising in this book. It also gives you a great idea of being able to understand the Polish history just a little bit more. And I would also recommend Halik's new book on resistance, because it talks about the Home Army and the building of the Home Army, which is great. So do head and buy those two books. Once you've hit those two, let me know and I will give you some more book recommendations. Otherwise, thank you so much for listening. Don't forget to go and like us on your favourite listening platform. Also, remember, we are on YouTube, and please go and comment and like on the episode that you like the most, or something you loved about the episode. Obviously, that's a bit of a difficult thing to say, but sometimes some of us do come out with something interesting that you might really like or not. Thank you so much. Have a really great day, and we'll see you tomorrow for Day 36.